Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and Stan Lee created an incredible superhero entertainment franchise in the 1960s. However, there were claims of who created what and controversies of stolen credit that have tainted their work in the decades since. Let's go down our timeline for each of the two crowning achievements of the 1960s Marvel Age: Fantastic Four with Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, and The Amazing Spider-Man with Steve Ditko and Stan Lee. As shown in previous episodes, Jack, Stan, and Steve co-created the Marvel Universe in the 1960s, but there have been differing accounts since of who created what and tension between all three creators that are interesting to examine. What blurs the waters even more is the Marvel method, which claims that Stan Lee gave them an idea, they'd flesh and plot it out and give it back to him to dialogue. Jack Kirby and Stan Lee co-created Fantastic Four 1, 1961, which started off the Marvel Universe, and the credit for the first issue reads like this on the right side. Steve Ditko and Stan Lee co-created Spider-Man in 1962, and the credit in his first appearance in Amazing Fantasy 15, 1962 reads like this on the bottom of the first page. So the credits of the creative team appear very straightforward in these panels. Now watch as the credits change over time. Let's start with the Fantastic Four. Fantastic Four 9, 1962 shows the creative credit change to Stan Lee as scriptwriter and Jack Kirby as artist. In Fantastic Four 17, 1963, the credit changes again to Stan Lee for the story and Jack Kirby for art. Then in Fantastic Four 18, 1963, the credit changes to the story being written by Stan Lee and again Jack Kirby for what is drawn. On the Spider-Man credits, the credit from Amazing Fantasy 15 shown earlier changes quickly in the first issue of Amazing Spider-Man 1963 to Stan Lee for the script and Steve Ditko for art. The credit changes again in Amazing Spider-Man 3, 1963 to story by Stan Lee and then art by Steve Ditko. The credit changes again in issue 5, 1963 to written by Stan Lee and drawn by Steve Ditko. So on both books, which were the cornerstones of the Marvel Universe in the 1960s, the credits were quite collaborative, and as the books became popular hits, the credit for the story and ideas therein flow more toward Stan Lee. So what does Stan mean in 1963 when it says written by? In 1967, Daredevil Annual 1, a 3-pager by Gene Colan and Stan Lee of an encounter between them, Stan Lee shows that written means he fills in the dialogue boxes left for him by the penciler, who mapped out the story in picture panels. It also shows Stan having a hard time coming up with an original story idea. This satire could be solely in jest or funny because it's true. Who knows? By some accounts, Stan Lee and a few others have said that he would give them an initial idea, the artist mapped it out, and he filled in dialogue bubbles after. Other accounts have said that there was never an initial idea, and that Stan would receive pages with story and art panels originated by the artist, and Stan would fill in the dialogue bubbles later. At this point, it is a game of he said, and there's no way to prove it. However, it is interesting to see published accounts of what some depict versus others in this controversy. So let's travel down the timeline to what is published regarding credit over at Marvel in the 1960s, especially in relation to Stan Lee and his creative partners Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko with a few others. In 1966, Stan Lee had an interview for the New York Herald Tribune, and they portray a Marvel method plotting session between Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, which appears fairly collaborative. Later on in 1966, Stan Lee had an interview with the Chicago Sun-Times Midwest where in a couple separate paragraphs he says, "What we were doing was creating fairy tales for adults." Note that he said the term we, denoting a collaborative group creation effort, which is admirable compared to what he says later in life. However, on the sidelines, the magazine editor or writer wrote that he created the new breed of superheroes like Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four. In the magazine's caption, they write specifically that it was he and not them that created those characters. This seems to be a common theme in his interviews where he says something and the media says another. Maybe it's just lazy journalism. I don't know. Did he tell them he created, or was that interpreted by the magazine writer because he was socially charismatic in his discussions? But that sort of thing rubs the pencilers, plotters like Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko the wrong way. In Sick Magazine 48, 1966, there are satire pages written by Joe Simon, Jack Kirby's ex-partner of many years, discussing Stan's credit grabbing at Marvel. In Angel and Abe 2, 1969, which mimics Roy Thomas and Stan Lee, inked by Wally Wood, they made Roy look like Stan and called called his character Stan Bragg, and Stan looked like Roy discussing signing work that isn't theirs in The Most Fantastic Robbery in History. Script by Sergio Aragonis and Bob Oxner. Pencils are by Oxner. In 1970, Jack left Marvel for DC, and Kirby said in an interview with Last Comic Collector 81, 1970, that he created the Fantastic Four. Stan Lee was on To Tell the Truth show in 1971. At this time, he was editor of Marvel and soon to be publisher. It is possible that his old creative partner Jack Kirby saw this 1971 episode and satirized Stan Lee, toupee and all, in Mr. Miracle 6, 1972. This issue was made after Jack left Marvel and went over to DC and satirized Stan Lee as Funky Flashman, as a verbose user and abuser of artistic talent, working as a driver of slaves in a happy Marvel family. In 1973, Stan Lee had been publisher for a year by then, and Kirby had been at DC for 3 years at this time, and in Foom 1, 1973, Marvel would turn up Stan's sole creatorship claim up a notch by writing that Stan Lee created the Marvel Age of Comics. In 1974, Stan Lee's personal language on the creation of the FF changes, where he claimed sole creatorship of the characters that he gave co-creatorship to in both prior interviews and earlier issue credit. So there is a definite change in Stan's recollection in creator credit compared to his 1966 interview, where he used the term we. At the same time, he discusses how it was his wife who inspired this sudden urge to create in his comics after 20 years in the business. In 1974, Jack Kirby returned to Marvel a few years after he depicted Stan Lee as Funky Flashman and said this about his time with Stan in the early 60s as a couple of guys who, quote-unquote, shared ideas. In Foom 11, 1975, Kirby had already now been at Marvel, and the language at Foom changes from Stan's sole creatorship to a co-creation shown here, speaking with Kirby. Later on in this interview, Jack discusses how happy he was at Marvel as if it was an old family. This is also an interesting change in language from Jack when he was back at Marvel compared to his sentiments that he expressed in Mr. Miracle 6, 1972, when he was at DC Comics. In 1975, Stan Lee was interviewed over in the United Kingdom working on Marvel UK duties when he said this regarding Jack Kirby in Fantasy Advertiser International, April of 1975 edition. He specifically says that Jack Kirby had a lot of great ideas but needed an editor to control him. In 1978, Jack Kirby said this about his collaboration with Stan Lee in Foom 19, 1977. He speaks positively about his time with Stan Lee, writing, "I've always enjoyed working with Stan. We've been a successful team. In the collaboration, something good comes out." This is clearly a far more positive tone by Jack Kirby regarding Stan Lee than what we will read later. Since Roy Thomas was mentioned in the satire panels, what did he think about Jack and Stan's co-creation of the Fantastic Four? In 1978, Roy Thomas said in Collector's Dream fanzine that the Fantastic Four's spirit derived from Jack Kirby's Challengers of the Unknown 1957, which is different than what Stan wrote in 1974, but more in line with the early credits that Stan once gave Jack in the early FF issues and the aforementioned 1966 interviews. Here is a short visual comparison of 1957 Jack Kirby Dave Wood's Challengers of the Unknown versus Jack Kirby Stan Lee's Fantastic Four. Jack Kirby left Marvel in 1978 to work in animation, then does some work with his Darkseid character in the 1980s, meanwhile struggling with Marvel in the 1980s to get his original art back, as well as try to delineate once and for all that he co-created the Fantastic Four, which didn't occur for a while. He had some encounters with John Byrne as well, which is discussed in the previous episode, and then in 1987 it was Jack Kirby's 70th birthday and he was interviewed on a radio show. Roughly 18 minutes into the interview, Jack Kirby says he had a deep role in the creation of Spider-Man and that all comic book art pages he turned during his 11 years at Marvel were all creatively his except for the dialogue and the balloons. Stan Lee calls in a couple minutes after that and they discuss a positive tone of working together with an acknowledgement of it being difficult to know for sure who did what. At 33 minutes, Stan Lee says that every word of dialogue is mine, every story, and then Jack says, "I wrote a few lines myself, and it was the action I was interested in." In 1990, he had an interview in the Comics Journal 134 with Gary Groff. At this point in his life, Jack is older and 4 years from death with a large amount of disappointment of what little credit or money he received for his Marvel co-creations. That interview can be found here. At this point in his life, Jack is older and 4 years from death with a large amount of disappointment of what little credit or money he received for his Marvel co-creations. First, Jack establishes that Stan Lee wasn't a writer or creator, but only an editor. Jack then establishes that it was he that created the Fantastic Four and the other characters and created all the stories, while Stan was more of a desk organizer of talent. Jack then tells Gary that Stan did not create the Fantastic Four. Jack Kirby also discusses he couldn't ever talk to Stan about his concerns with the application of credit on their Marvel issues, and further says Stan was the editor of Marvel, had all the influence, and was the point man, so Stan could do whatever he wanted with the pages. Jack goes on to say that he would word the pages as well before handing them in. Jack has mentioned that he continued to go along with the process because he was blackballed from DC, as discussed in an earlier episode, and needed the freelance fees to support his wife and family. Take in mind that Roz, his wife, corrected Jack on the placement of the words in the above quote, showing that he misremembered a detail in this interview, so there is a chance he misremembered other details. Jack also says that he solely conceived the stories for the pages and explained how Stan flattered him to take more of his ideas. Jack then warns Gary of ever working with that sort of personality. Roz Kirby, Jack's wife, even asked the question, what did Stan actually create before Jack came along and after he left? This 1990 interview with Gary Groth is an imprint of the type of emotions that he probably took to his death. It lays a despondent picture of someone who feels exploited. In 1991, Fantastic Four 358 prints a letter from Stan Lee describing that the following 2 pages are 2 out of 4 pages of his original script, which plotted the first issue of the Fantastic Four dated July 1961. This document was not seen until the 1980s. Jack died in 1994, and Stan Lee was seen at Jack Kirby's funeral. In Fantastic Four 400 in 1995, Stan Lee writes again on the origins of the Fantastic Four, and it differs significantly from his 1974 Origins book. He specifically writes that Jack Kirby and I created the Fantastic Four in a more collaborative effort similar to his 1966 interview. In 1998, Roy Thomas said that Stan Lee wasn't sure if he wrote the Fantastic Four 1 synopsis before or after speaking to Jack Kirby first in Jack Kirby Collector 18, 1998. Dick Ayers wrote and illustrated his autobiography in 2005 as a Dick Ayers story and depicted their relationship with Ayers wanting more storytelling credit. In 2014, the Jack Kirby estate heirs and Marvel Disney settled and finally gave co-creator credit to Jack Kirby along with Stan Lee. Oddly enough, it took 53 years for the current Marvel credits, shown bottom, to finally reflect the original credits shown in Fantastic Four 1, 1961. Well, that ends the Kirby arm of the discussion. Join us in the next episode for the Ditko arm of the discussion, as well as the grand finale. Cheers and see you there. Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko,